I'm Stephen Pashby. I'm an account manager with Design Hammer, and this is David Minton. He's our managing partner. And today we're going to talk about website accessibility. It's not just a good idea, it's the law, sort of. So a quick overview of what we're going to cover. We'll do an introduction. We'll talk about what is accessibility. We'll go over some of the pertinent federal regulations and why it is not always so simple to understand what you're actually supposed to do. We'll talk about some of the specific disabilities that you need to make your website accessible for. We'll review some automated accessibility testing tools. And then we'll talk about some recent court cases that sort of highlight some of the challenges about understanding what is actually required for what organizations. So let's start with a disclaimer. We're not lawyers, so don't take any of this as legal advice. We're also more on the business development and strategy side of our firm, so we won't tell you how to fix your website, but we will do our best to point you in the right direction. So what we will cover: what is accessibility? Why should you bother with accessibility? And how can you test your site? What we won't cover is your particular legal responsibilities regarding accessibility, and we'll get into that a little bit, why that's a difficult question, and also how specifically, point by point, to make your website accessible. So, the what, where, and when of website accessibility. What is accessibility? So, web accessibility means people with disabilities can use the web. More specifically, web accessibility means people with disabilities can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, and that they can contribute to the web. So, why should you care about this? Well, the Center for Persons with Disabilities points out that the web is not a barrier to people with disabilities, it is a solution. The web has the potential to revolutionize the day-to-day lives of millions of people with disabilities by increasing their ability to independently access information and other aspects of life that most people take for granted. So, why specifically? First off, it's the right thing to do, right? You want your website to be accessible to everyone, so that everyone can access the information, features, whatever that you're offering on your site. If you're a business, it attracts new and retains existing customers. And generally, if you have improved accessibility, it also improves the usability for all users. And it's the law, and it may apply to you. So as you start to think about accessibility, a good set of principles is the POUR principles. And POUR stands for perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And just a side, I notice folks are taking notes somewhat feverishly. We're posting our slides. You can check out our SlideShare account. We'll have it there. It's the Design Hammer SlideShare account. We'll also be posting them on a blog post on our site, and I believe we're going to be giving them to Drupal Camp Atlanta. So don't feel that you need to get everything down, because we have 114 slides. So back to POUR. Perceivable, operable, understandable, robust. So perceivable. Users need to be aware of web content. So they need to be able to perceive it. Operable. Users need to be able to navigate, find, and interact with web content. Understandable. Users need to be able to comprehend all navigation, interaction, and content. And robust. Enable users to choose technology to meet their accessibility needs. So, with those principles in mind, it's now really useful to think about the types of disabilities that you want to make sure that is able to actually use all of those points of website accessibility. So, broadly speaking, there are several types of disabilities: visual disabilities, auditory disabilities, motor disabilities, cognitive disabilities, and then users with seizure disabilities. For visual disabilities, for many of these there's a spectrum. For visual disabilities, you have blindness, but you also have low vision and color blindness. So with blindness, you're working with users who are using probably a screen reader. So they're not going to be able to take in any information that is only given visually. You also have users with low vision who might be working with very high magnification on their screen. So, if you have a lot of stuff that's tied into the layout, that may not work for them. And then you have users with color blindness. So if you're using color as the only thing to denote parts of the UI, users with color blindness are not going to be able to see that and operate it. Auditory disabilities also have a continuum of deafness and hard of hearing. So if you have audio content or video content that has audio, and there is no other place that this information is, then there is no way that people with a auditory disability will be able to appreciate it and understand it. And so you've got, for videos, closed captioning, and for audio, you need to have transcripts. So motor impairment is another one that I think a lot of folks, when they think about accessibility, they will go to visual impairment and think about that, and to auditory impairment. But motor impairment, I think, is one that folks don't think of immediately. So if someone has a motor impairment, they may be unable to use a mouse, or they may have just generally poor fine motor control, or they may have slow reaction time. So if you think of a website that has very small touch targets, that has navigation that you can only use via a mouse, that has timed interaction that you have to react in a certain amount of time, that you can't pause or go back, then these are all aspects of a website that will make someone with motor impairments have a very difficult time using the website, if they can use it at all. You also have to think about those with cognitive disabilities, such as learning disability or ADD. If you have a website that is very confusingly laid out, someone with cognitive disabilities may not be able to navigate it successfully. Or if you've got something that is just a wall of text, or is kind of all over the place, it can be very difficult. And then you also need to think about those with seizure disorders. You want to make sure that your website does not induce those with visual effects. So I'm going to turn this over to David, and he's going to talk about regulations, guidelines, etc.
Got to try to tag team this microphone here, so bear with us. So this is where it starts to get interesting, talking about regulations and guidelines. Some of these you've probably heard of, some of them apply to the web, some of them you may not have thought have applied to the web, and some you may not be familiar with. So the first one we'll talk about is Section 508, and then we'll talk about Title II and Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also WCAG 2.0. So what's Section 508, which is the one most people have probably heard of? It's an amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It was approved in 1998 with compliance for those it applies to required by 2001. There's been a notice of proposed rulemaking. It was announced in February 2015, but as of now, I'm not quite sure when the expected release is. This is actually pretty good news, because if you think about it, we're currently, if Section 508 applies to your organization, you're working on rules that were written in 1998. I was working on the web in 1998. I'm not sure if all of you were even born in 1998. So this is kind of a big deal. So right now, I think when I first made this slide deck for a talk earlier this year, We were supposed to get these guidelines by September of this year, last month. That got pushed back to right now, April of 2016. It may come out then, may be pushed back again, not sure. So what's the status of 508? There right now is a proposed information and communication technology standards and guidelines. And so the thought right now is rather than having a separate set of guidelines, which we're operating under right now, that were written in 1998, they would just go to use Web Content Accessibility Guidelines from the World Wide Web Consortium. And so rather than the government trying to maintain its own list, it would just say whatever is WCAG 2.0 will be what's required. That's what the current thought is, how it's going to go. That's probably good news because then it allows a lot more flexibility. And we don't want to get stuck with a set of web guidelines, 20 years from now that hasn't changed. It's my understanding this is currently under review, and we're not quite sure when this change will be authorized. So for those of you who Section 508 applies to, you're still stuck with what was drafted in 1998. So what are these standards? Is anyone out there currently working with them? No? Okay.
Who does it apply to?
We'll talk about that. So Section 508 is only 16 paragraphs long in its specific guidelines that apply to the web. As I mentioned, it's not been updated in years, and some of it refers to some obsolete techniques, and some of them are very specific in what you have to do, some of them are very vague, and as you would expect, many of them are open to interpretation. You can go read some guidelines from section508.gov, and there's some specific information about this refresh that's underway. So in general, Section 508 applies to the federal government agencies, and those receiving money from the federal government. So what's Title II? It's a section of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And the part that applies is generally, no qualified individual with a disability shall, on the basis of disability, be excluded from participation in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, or activities of a public entity. And by public entity, there's a long definition, but to kind of sum it up, it's any department, agency, or other instrumentality of a state or states or local government. So it's pretty understandable that the website of a state or local government agency is a service of that agency. You think about your state's DMV, you want to find out information about where a driver's license office is or what's on the test. If your disability does not prevent you from getting a driver's license, or maybe that's where you want to get your state ID, which someone who's not able to drive would probably need, you would think they should not be inhibited from being able to get that information from that agency website. So what's a little bit more sticky is we also have Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And this is something that we'll talk about in the specific court cases. There's one paragraph that seems to be the crux of the court cases, which is, for some reason it is wanting to fly past. No individual shall be discriminated against on the basis of disability in the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations of any place of public accommodation by any person who owns, leases, or leases to, or operates a place of public accommodation. And so a lot of this seems to be hinging on the word of, so that people are looking at services of the public accommodation. And then the question is, what is a public accommodation? And we'll talk about that some more on the court cases. But so like a lot of the law, it hinges on something very, very specific. So the last part that we'll talk about in this section is what's WCAG 2.0. It's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. is developed by the Web Accessibility Initiative, which is part of the World Wide Web Consortium, and it was first published in 2008, so 10 years after Section 508. And it's right now not written into law in the United States, but it's the basis for the laws on accessibility in a lot of other countries. I think specifically in the EU, they use that. And so we've also got some information to help you with that. You can actually go to the Web Accessibility Initiative. They've got their own website. And there's also the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines themselves. And there's a pretty complete set of instructions on how to meet WCAG 2. And we'll give you some examples of that later. The current status of WCAG is it's currently a guideline. What's really nice about it is it's success-based. They tell you what you have to do and then very specific examples of how you would either achieve success in meeting the guideline or specific things that you would do to fail. So it's sort of the opposite of the Section 508 guidelines. It doesn't require specific techniques, which is one of the flaws, at least now, with very old Section 508. They're very specific on some things that are really, really obsolete. WCAG 2 is more about success. As long as you meet some success criteria, it's not specific on how you do it. That provides a lot of examples of how you could do it. And as I mentioned, it gives you a lot of different scenarios, so it helps you kind of work out what you need to do. So let's hand over back to Stephen, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and what exactly do you need to do?
All right, so we'll get into a little more detail on specific guidelines. A lot of this is going to be centered around the WCAG 2.0. We're not going to go through every point of it, but we're going to give you a couple of examples of sort of how to think about this and then some tools of how to deal with it. So to go back to our POUR list, right, perceivable. So for something to be perceivable, you need to provide text alternatives for non-text content. You need to provide captions or other alternate methods of getting the content from multimedia. You need to create content that can be presented in different ways, including by assistive technologies, without losing meaning. And you need to make it easier for users to see and hear content. For operable, you need to make sure all functionality is available via the keyboard. And you need to give users enough time to read and use content. Do not use content that causes seizures. And you need to help users navigate and find content. Make sure it's understandable. You need to make text readable and understandable. Should make content appear and operate in predictable ways. You want to help users avoid and correct mistakes. So you don't want to have, for example, a place where users make a choice and then they're unable to navigate back to the previous screen because they realize, oh, I selected the wrong thing. And you want to make sure that your implementation is robust, because you want to maximize compatibility with current and future user tools. So now that you've got those in mind, we're going to go through some different automated testing tools and also how to think about how to use these tools. So David likes to think of accessibility testers like spelling or grammar checkers. If you're a competent writer, they can help you find errors and make improvements. But if you run one on a foreign language text, you'll clear all of the errors, but will likely wind up with gibberish. So, when you're testing, what should you expect? You'd think just pass and fail, right? But that's not really the case. You'll have some things that pass. You'll have some things that pass conditionally that you'll need to manually check. You'll have some things that fail. And then you also have false positives and negatives. So let's look at a specific example both from 508 and from WCAG 2.0. So here's the 508. As you see, it's very straightforward, very prescriptive. Text equivalent for every non-text element should be provided, for example, an image, via alt or a long disk or an element content. Then we can look at the WCAG 2.0. All non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose except for the situations listed below. And here are the exceptions. A short description can serve the same, if a short description can serve the same purpose and present the same information as non-text content. If a short description cannot serve the same purpose and present the same information as non-text content, for example, a chart or a diagram. If non-text content is a control or accepts user input. If non-text content is time-based media, including live video only or live audio only, a test or exercise that would be invalid if presented in text, or primarily intended to create a specific sensory experience. If non-text content is a CAPTCHA. If non-text content should be ignored by assistive technology. And we're not going to go through all of these, but they show a variety of different alternatives and some specific failures of success criteria. So, with that in mind, we've got two different standards. Let's look at an implementation and see what can happen if we test for things. So, we have an image. It is an image of a stop sign. So, does the image have alt text? No. So in a tester, this will fail. And since there is meaning being conveyed by the image, we know this also fails compliance. Right? So it's failure of success criterion 1.1.1 due to omitting the alt attribute of text element on image area, on image elements, area elements, or input of type image. All right? So let's look again. So now we have an alt element, but it's blank. So it's going to fail the tester. And again, this fails compliance. All right. So let's look again. So now we have it with stop. So we have an alt image. It's a conditional pass to the tester in that the tester says, well, you have something there, but I don't know if it's relevant. And compliance, this passes. This indicates the same meaning. Right? So that's appropriate for non-text content. Now here's something that will pass a tester, but is wrong. Right? Placeholder is not the same meaning as stop. So the tester would be a conditional pass, but this fails compliance. All right? And here's another example. Go. Again, this will pass the tester, but fail compliance because we now have just the wrong meaning there. So let's look at a different example. So here we have sort of a swirly visual element. There's no information being displayed by this. So for example, if we had alt text of curl here, the tester is going to be a conditional pass because, hey, you've got alt text. But this actually is a failure in compliance because this is purely a visual element. There is no meaning being conveyed by this. And so this is something that if someone's using a screen reader, they now have some extraneous information that's not relevant to the page content at all. If they, this is something that the screen reader should actually skip. So another approach would be to have alt text that was absent entirely. It'll fail the tester. And again, this fails compliance because you need to actually have the alt text there so that the screen reader can properly understand what that is. So here we have an example where we have alt text there but blank. So the tester, conditional pass or failure, it doesn't quite know But this is compliance, because now we have the alt tag there. We know what's going on, but since it's not conveying information, it should be blank, and the screen reader should be able to skip over it. So, with that in mind, let's talk about some different testing software that you can take a look at and kind of some of the use cases for these. So, when looking at different types of testing software, you've got several different options as to how they're available. So there are SaaS hosted options, there are browser plugins, and then there are desktop applications. So some examples, and we'll go through these a little bit more detail. For example, an example of a SaaS hosted option is Cynthia Says. An example of a browser plugin is the Wave plugin for Firefox or Chrome. And then an example of a desktop application is Total Validator. So let's take a look at some screenshots and some pros and cons. So Cynthia Says it's a software as a service. Here's an example of what it outputs. It's a little small. We probably ought to make this slide bigger next time. Basically, it will go through and basically say, here are what fails, here's what needs a manual check. Some nice things with Cynthia Says, it provides feedback by requirement, particular 508 statutes, etc. You can set it to test 508, the different WCAG compliance standards. Some of the cons is it tests one page at a time. So if you have a website that you've inherited and you need to bring it into compliance, and it's a large website, this is probably not the best tool for you. And it can't test password protected environments. So for example, one thing that we tend to do, and maybe something that you do, is we keep our development sites behind an htaccess password to keep Google from indexing them. Well, that means we can't use Cynthia Says on our development sites because they've got htaccess in front of them. So another one we can look at is the Wave plugin. And so here's an example of this, and you see it shows you a nice overlay of the screen with little icons indicating here's a warning or here's something that fails. Some pros to the Wave plugin. It's free, so that's nice. You can play with it. It displays the web page with embedded icons and can test password protected sites because you're able to interact with the website, you can enter the password and navigate normally. Some cons, again, it only tests one page at a time. And so the Wave plugin has a little bit of a philosophical decision they've made, is they want to test accessibility as a concept as opposed to specifically to particular standards. So their tests, while they are based on 508 or WCAG, are not specifically 508 or WCAG. They have basically they say, well, since you can't actually certify that you're in 508 compliance with an automated tester or WCAG compliance with an automated tester, we're not even going to say that we're doing that. We're just going to have our own tests. They're related to them, but you have to manually check stuff. And so if you need to be in 508 compliance, we're not going to help you out by saying, well, you're not in compliance with this item here. Another one to look at is Total Validator. And as you can see, this is a little less pretty. And basically, it just says, go to the first problem in your HTML. So Total Validator has some pros. There's a free basic version that's kind of nice. You can try it out. It provides a line-by-line analysis of code. And you can test specific versus specific standards. And it can crawl multiple pages on a site. So if you're trying to say, okay, I've got a site, I need to go through all the pages on the site and find out what is not in compliance with 508 and what I need to check, Total Validator is a nice choice. Some cons. The free page only tests one page at a time, so you'll have to pay for it. And it makes the assumption that the user understands code. So if you are more of a site builder or a content editor, Total Validator might not be the best choice for you. But if you're a developer or you're looking for something for your developers to worry about navigation or something like that, Total Validator might be a good choice. So there are a couple of questions you need to ask yourself when you're determining which tool is kind of the right one for you. Do you need a test password to protect the site? If you're working on a site that's non-public and making the changes before it's launched, then that's something you need to think about. Do you need to test more than one page? So, for example, if you have a site that is accessible and you have a content editor who's creating new content, then testing a single page might be a good choice, because then you'll be able to just look at that page, go through, find the problems, correct them. But if you're going over a site that needs to be fully reviewed, you'll want to probably pick a tool that's going to help that out. Do you need to test code or only content? If you already have your navigation built to be accessible, then some testers will give you a lot of information you don't need. Whereas if you need to actually do a complete audit of the site, you want to make sure you've got something that's going to help you with that. And so, as I said, do you need to maintain compliance or build a new site, fix an existing site? So, where should you start? The Wave extension for Chrome is pretty handy, so we'll go through some steps with that. So the Wave extension provides a summary and a list of errors, has an error pop-up in Code Viewer, documentation of individual errors, and also an outline view of the particular problems, a no style sheet view, so to actually see the content without the style, just using the structure that's there, and then a contrast check and desaturated view for folks with visual impairment. So step one, download and install. Once you've got that, you can then do see the summary. You see the summary over there on the left. It says 36 errors, 25 alerts, so on and so forth. You can expand that.
You can note the irony, this is the Americans with Disability Act website.
So you can look at the details, detail view, and you can filter by errors or alerts, click on individual ones. For example, here's a form that is missing a label. So that means that someone using a screen reader won't necessarily know what this form field is asking for. Here's another one where you've got several problems, empty link, a link that contains no text. And let's see. Here's an example of kind of the outline view. So this is showing you the structure of the content using your HTML structure, so your headlines, so on and so forth. It's important for screen readers to actually have proper HTML structure. So you should have a single H1, you have multiple H2s, multiple H3s, so on and so forth. So it makes it easier for the screen reader to navigate and for the user to understand, where the content, like the different hierarchy of the content. So if you just have style there, you don't have structure, then you make it difficult for the screen reader to understand what's going on. And you can kind of experience this by doing the Wave no style view. So it's just like, hey, here's a bunch of text. And if you don't have your H1s and stuff there, this is going to be difficult to read. You can also look at turning the no contrast or the contrast view on, and it'll tell you if it detects any contrast issues. So this is an area where I think a website actually does well, so that's good. And then here's a desaturated view to check for color. That might be a problem. So I'm going to turn it back over to David, and he's going to go over legislation, legal settlements, and court decisions.
This is where it gets a little interesting. So there's some different enforcement options, which is something none of us wants to be on the wrong end of, where for some reason some party feels that you should have an accessible website and also that you don't. So there can be legislative action, an existing law or a new law is passed. There can be Justice Department settlement agreements where the Justice Department comes to you and tells you you should do something. And then there are also cases that go through the court system. So a little bit about some of the federal legislation. We kind of touched on that at the very beginning when we were talking about the different guidelines. Some of the existing legislation is the federal agency websites. They're covered by the amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And so that is Section 508. So it applies to specifically federal agency websites. Then something else that's interesting, because these are for-profit businesses, most airline websites are covered by an amendment to the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986. So we're starting to see that if you thought, I'm not in government, I don't get money from government, website accessibility doesn't apply to me, that's not correct. So if you're a federal agency, you've got to deal with the U.S. General Services Administration, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. As we mentioned earlier, it was approved in 1998. You had to be compliant by 2001, and that's Section 508 and specifically 1194. Now, if you're in the airline industry, you're under the Department of Transportation. And there was an amendment to the Air Carrier Access Act of 1986. And this was approved not too long ago, November of 2013, and compliance is supposed to be by December of 2015. And unlike the federal agencies that are using the really old Section 508, this law specifies WCAG 2.0 levels A and AA as what is necessary for compliance. Then there's some DOJ agreements, Department of Justice, and we'll give you some examples such as Ahold USA Inc. and Peapod LLC cases, also the National Museum of Crime and Punishment. So Ahold USA, they've got a website which is peapod.com. It's an online grocery service. It's a for-profit, online-only business, and this was a settlement in 2014. Department of Justice said your website should be meeting WCAG version 2 level AA standards, and there was no penalty. So essentially the DOJ went to this company and said, hey, get in compliance or else, and the company decided not to find out what for else would mean. So there was no penalty for this. Kind of a similar case was the National Museum of Crime and Punishment in Washington, D.C. They have a website, and they're a for-profit museum, but they also have a physical place. So that also makes it a little different. The other one was a online-only business. This was in January of this year. DOJ said your website should comply to WCAG version 2 level AA, the same. And it was another case with no penalties. DOJ said you need to get in compliance or else, and the museum decided not to find out what for or else meant. There are some other instances where we've got specific court cases. Some of these are going to be past cases, and some of them are still winding their way through the court system. So some of the applicable ones are the National Federation of the Blind and Heidi Vines versus ScribD. You're probably familiar with that service. There was also Melissa J. Earll versus eBay, Donald Cullen versus Netflix, the National Association of the Deaf versus Netflix, and US versus Miami University. So notice some of these are from individuals, some of them are from nonprofits that represent sort of classes of disabled, and one of them is an actual government suit. So some of the ones that those who are trying to follow case law and trying to figure out where the government is going, pay attention to is the National Federation of the Blind versus ScribD. ScribD is a for-profit, online-only business. In March of 2015, the U.S. District Court for the District of Vermont denied a motion to dismiss. So, and it was, the court case is based on Title III of Americans with Disabilities Act. And you remember that was the one that hinged on the word of. So the question is ScribD a for-profit web-only business, a public accommodation? They and their attorneys felt they were not, and filed a motion that the case should be dismissed because they're not a public accommodation, and the court disagreed. And I believe that one is still in progress, but that gives you a hint about the way the court is leaning on that. So that was East Coast. Now we'll go to West Coast and Earll versus eBay. eBay, we all know, is a for-profit, online-only business. In April 2015, the U.S. Ninth Circuit ruled because eBay's services are not connected to any actual physical place, eBay is not subject to the ADA. So that district court, circuit court, says that a website-only business is not a public accommodation. So what we're kind of getting towards is we'll probably go to the Supreme Court at some point, since districts and circuits seem to be coming to different conclusions. So because of the ruling, there were no penalties because the circuit ruled that ADA does not apply to them. Then there's Cullen versus Netflix. We all know Netflix is a for-profit, online-only business. Same circuit, U.S. Ninth Circuit, actually the exact same ruling. Because Netflix services are not connected to any actual physical place, Netflix is not subject to the ADA. So nice to see that that circuit at least has some consistency. It was supposed to fall under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act as a public accommodation. Because of the ruling, there were no penalties. The case was dismissed. So now we've got National Association of the Deaf versus Netflix. Netflix, for-profit, online-only business. October of 2012, the U.S. District Court for Massachusetts ruled that the ADA applies to web-only businesses. And this was also under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, with the court agreeing in this case that Netflix is a public accommodation. And the penalties were $800,000. And I believe that was both, majority of that was court costs, because they lost the case. They had to cover the plaintiff's court costs. And then the rest of that was for compliance issues. So they've agreed to provide captioning to their streaming videos. And I think about $100,000 of that was just for compliance monitoring over a certain period of time to make sure that they actually were going to abide by the court ruling. One that's just came out recently is U.S. versus Miami University, and that's Miami of Ohio. Miami of Ohio is a public university, and so they've got both a physical presence and online presence. September of 2015, U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Ohio said that their website falls under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which would make sense because they're a state university. This case is still in progress.
This case is still in progress.
You had a question. Those two Netflix cases, what was the ruling was different, but what was the difference?
Because there were different courts.
Versus the other?
Because there were different
That's the
courts.
reason.
Because that's the only reason?
That's the
Right.
reason.
So two conflicting?
Right.
That's,
It was under the public accommodations, whether a web-only business with no physical location can be a public accommodation. And essentially that's why we have a Supreme Court, because we've got our different districts, which then can appeal to the circuits, and then circuit rulings can be then sent to the Supreme Court. And so this will probably make it there because there are different circuits are having different rulings. And it looks like it's somewhat of an East Coast, West Coast thing. I think districts in Vermont in Massachusetts were seeing websites as public accommodations, and the Ninth Circuit on the West Coast was saying a website is a website. There's no way it can be a public accommodation. So that kind of goes back to the beginning where we said this is complicated, and at least right now there is no right or wrong answer, and we are not giving you any legal advice. So yes, the court split on rulings. Are web-only businesses places of a public accommodation under Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act? Is the website a public accommodation only as an extension of a business with an actual physical place? Or does Title III even apply to websites at all? As we saw, the courts are split on this. It will probably go to the Supreme Court based on these cases, or there may be new legislation out of Congress, or there could be new regulations directly out of a federal agency, and with those, we'll probably see new court cases. So it will probably go to the Supreme Court at some point. So conclusions and resources, which is what you're all here for. Unfortunately, there's no silver bullet to make sites accessible. Even better, accessibility is a never-ending process. And I'll just kind of hit on that. A lot of us are probably developers or work for development shops, and one of the scariest things when someone comes and says, I want an accessible website, and you have to somehow get them to realize that accessibility is a process. It's not a destination. Only in the good old days when we were building static websites and our clients had to send us every single text change, if that was the case, then as developers, we could make sure that sites remain compliant. But as soon as we handed over content management systems and someone can upload an image and put in no alt text or bad alt text, all of a sudden that site that we worked so hard to make compliant is no longer compliant. And that's one of the toughest things, is getting the clients to understand that anyone they allow to add content to their website now has to either understand website accessibility and compliance, or you have to have a multi-step approval process where you've got certain people who are trained who have to approve all content before it gets published. And more importantly, the legal landscape is in flux. Look for new rulings and regulations in 2015. Should cross that out. It's now 2016. And so some resources. I wrote a blog post a few months ago where we've got kind of a slightly older version of this slide deck, but still has all the good information. That's the direct URL, or else we've got a short one. So if you want to grab that, it's bit.ly DH access. And we want to thank all of you for coming out early in the morning before the keynote, and also thank Drupal Camp Atlanta for allowing us the opportunity to speak today. And there is our slide deck with 1 minute to spare. So, got 1 minute for questions. Yes?
Got 1 minute for questions. Yes?
So, do you have any suggestions for dealing with dynamic content? So, like a web application, that like 90% of it is being generated by JavaScript.
Right.
I mean, that seems a real problem. The kind of just static markup issues.
Right.
Those are fairly well documented. What you need to do. Everything's moving that fast.
It's more.
The technology is so far behind.
It is. It's more complicated.
So, any suggestions on resources where they're exploring these issues?
There are a lot of websites that are aimed specifically at these issues, and so that's something to look at. There is some wiggle room in sort of different but equal. It's generally frowned upon, but if you can make a very strong case that you just can't make something accessible, if you have something that provides all the content in a better user experience, there's often the ability, but you have to really, really be able to defend it, that you've got a separate system that overcomes some of those issues.
And that's not really in the spirit of supporting, the whole legal side is fine. I've heard different numbers, but it's like 5-2% of the public
Right.
is growing falls under this category.
Right.
So if you're not
Right.
accessible, you're
Yep.
losing a lot.
So, I mean, I think the key thing with something that's an alternate system is it has to be a better experience than just trying to fix your current one. So say you've got like a dynamic map where you can move things around and hover over things, and a lot of its purpose is to be able to like move things around and get dynamic information. It might be better just to have a narrative than trying to somehow make this system accessible for the visually impaired. That might be sort of an example, that trying to explain the information that someone is manipulating objects to try to determine themselves would be a better experience, but that's where you have to have much better advice than you're going to get from a 50-minute Drupal camp talk. So probably one question?
So probably one question.
Yeah, is there anything you can do or any to apply for a user or client entered comments in? If they want to drop some images over there and stuff like that, is there any way to control that?
I think there you just have to have probably some good releases, talk to your lawyer, get something in place. It's hard for us where we essentially tell our clients, you need to understand this if you want to be able to adjust your own content, and if not, it's really on you. They don't like hearing that. Yes?
Can you go back 2 slides?
Which one?
Back 2 slides. There's a link.
Whoops. Oops.
That was it.
We are going to be posting the slides on SlideShare, and we'll have a new blog post with the slides on our website, probably by early afternoon, I would guess.
Thank you, everybody.